In this video, we'll demonstrate how to integrate the Kommunicate SDK into your React Native project. We've created a demo application available on both Android and iOS. This application allows you to perform basic functions such as logging in as a visitor, creating conversations, opening a conversation list, and performing a logout function. While these are the basic functions, there are many more customizations available. For more details, you can check out the docs.communicate. In the React Native section, you'll find a wealth of information, including sections on authentication, push notifications, how to create a conversation, and how to log out. Throughout this video, we'll be following this documentation. This will help you better understand the Kommunicate SDK. We will also cover any errors encountered during the integration process. Let's begin with the integration of the Kommunicate SDK into your React Native project. To do this, simply run the npm command, which will download the Kommunicate SDK. You can also refer to our React Native Kommunicate plugin page. You can check the latest version of the SDK on the React Native Kommunicate page. At the time of this recording, the latest version is 2.4.1. We'll be using this version for this video. The README documentation is also available here. Let's begin by copying this npm React Native code and running it in the directory. This will download the React Native package. Now that the package is downloaded, let's proceed with the documentation. In this step, you need to navigate to the iOS directory and ensure that the platform is 13 and the use framework is enabled. Now, let's go to the iOS pod file. Here, we find that the platform is the minimum supported version. It should be at least 13, and we need to add the use framework here. This will enable the use of the framework. After saving this, there's a basic import statement that needs to be used. We will skip this for now and try to build the application for both Android and iOS. Let's start with Android. As you can see, the build failed. It seems the issue is related to allow backup. If you encounter a similar problem, we have a troubleshooting section that covers this. In the Android troubleshooting section, you'll find information about allow backup and the full backup content. This is something you'll need to add. For now, let's address this issue. The solution is to navigate to the Android app's main manifest and replace the allow backup value if it's being used in your code. This will override any previous value. The final value will be what you input here. Now, we'll add the allow backup and backup content settings. We also need to add a namespace for the tools. This can be copied from another project in the Android main manifest. Let's save this and run it again. We've encountered another error related to the process manifest. If you're not using full backup content, you can avoid this issue. Now, the current issue we're facing involves a duplicate class. The solution for this is to add properties to the Gradle properties file. We need to enable Jetify and disable the new architecture. In the current project, we'll do the same. We'll navigate to the Gradle properties and disable the new architecture. We'll also enable Jetify. For now, we'll copy these settings from another project. Lastly, we need to disable the Android Enable certifier. Let's enable this for now and proceed to save it. Now, we'll attempt to run it again on Android. We're intentionally going through these build failures because it can assist you in troubleshooting your application while integrating the Kommunicate SDK. Not everyone will encounter these errors, but if you do, you'll learn how to resolve these issues. Now that the build is successful and the application has started, we're encountering an issue where it's showing unable to load microscript. This is due to some network config rules present in the Android side of the Kommunicate SDK. On the community side, we have some network config files. If your project has these, you can override the rules by entering your network config rule here. This issue arises because it's blocking some IPs, preventing the Metro server from communicating. To fix this, go back to your manifest and add the network security config file. We'll add our network security config file here. For our project, we need to create one, so we'll copy it from a different project and add it here. Let's find this file. It's located in Resources, XML, and here. This file allows HTTP transmission and the IP which is allocated for Metro. We'll do the same for our project by navigating to the project's resources. There seems to be no XML folder. Let's create one right here. Now, in this XML folder, we need to create a file named Network Security Config. Here, we're going to paste the clear text transmission. We'll also add these details to our troubleshooting documentation. We'll update the documentation with the flow. Once we've saved this file, we need to ensure the file name matches the one we've referenced. Now we're ready to start the project again. As you can see, the build is successful and everything is running smoothly. Next, let's move on to the iOS side. We'll go to the iOS directory. Since we added the use framework, we need to perform a POD install. So, let's do the POD install in the iOS directory. Let's begin by installing all the necessary files. It appears there's an issue. Unable to find CocoaPods, unable to find React Native, and Nodal was not resolved. No worries, we can resolve this by running rep update. Now, we will execute pod install with the repo update. This should resolve the issue we faced earlier. Moving forward, since the Kommunicate SDK is now integrated into our React Native project, we'll begin with authentication. If you refer to the React Native documentation, there's a section on authentication checks. There are two ways to perform a user login. The first method is to log in as a visitor. In this case, a random user ID is generated for the user. There's no need to pass any email or other information. Everything is randomized. The second method is to log in as a user. Here, you can pass your own user ID, create a password, and even add an image. There's a lot of room for customization. Here are all the parameters it accepts. You can input all these parameters and then proceed to log in. There's also a function used to check if the user is logged in. If you need to verify whether a user is logged in to communicate, this function will come in handy. You can also update user details by inputting the key value. To update any field, such as the display name, simply enter the new name and call the Update Conversation Info function. This will update the user's details. For the sake of this video, we'll start with the Login as a Visitor function. We'll create this function and use it in our project. Let's go to the login screen. Here you can see two functions, handle login and enter login as visitor. We'll start with login as a visitor and use the getRandomUserID function. This function will return a random string, which will serve as the user ID for now. After obtaining this, we will create a KMUser object. This involves creating a JSON object of a user and passing in the user ID parameter, which is necessary for further proceedings. Next, we will address the application ID. To obtain this, navigate to the Kommunicate dashboard. Once there, go to the Settings, then to the Install section, and click on Install. Here you will find the app ID. Copy this and input it in the app ID field. With these steps completed, the KMUser object is created. We can ignore the device APN for now, as it is primarily used for notifications and releases on the iOS side. Now that the KMUser is created, we can pass this user into the functions. Moving forward, create a copy of this RNK Communicate Chat, so React Native Communicate Chat can perform login and pass this KMUser here. Next, we need to import the RNB Communicate Chat, which hasn't been done yet. To do this, navigate to the Installation section and import the module from this. Once imported, you'll see the React Native Communicator in the chat indicating it has been successfully added. Now, let's move on to the authentication process for a visitor. Let's save this and run it. Additionally, we'll navigate to the home screen, as that's where the user will be directed once the login is successful. After saving this, we'll run the Android version of this application. Now, let's check the JSON. We'll remove this native install yarn and run it. Once it's resolved, we'll run the Android version again and try to run the same function in both Android and iOS. Now, let's build the project for Android. It seems I've commented this out, so let's uncomment it and run it again. By executing this function, the user will be logged in. Once the user is logged in, we can create a conversation for that user and see the list of conversations created by that user. Now that it's started on Android, let's run it on iOS as well. Next, we'll attach it to the debugger so you can see what's happening. Let's attach the Android debugger. Alright, let's start with the login as a visitor. Tap on this one, and as you can see, the user is logged in successfully. This object you see is what's returned after a successful login. There's no need for you to do anything with this object, but it does contain important details about the user once they've logged in. After logging in, you'll see that I've navigated to the conversation screen. This is where you can create a conversation, open a conversation list, and log out. Let's start by creating a conversation. To do this, refer to the documentation. Specifically, head to the conversation section. Here, you'll find instructions on how to start a new conversation. To start a new conversation, you'll need to create a conversation object. This object can contain several parameters. One such parameter is single conversation. This parameter is used to create a single-threaded conversation. This means that for one user logged in at a time, there can only be one conversation. Therefore, you can't create a new conversation while one is already active. This example will involve just one conversation. Each time a user taps on a conversation, they can view both the previous and the new conversation simultaneously. So, it's essentially the same thing. We can simply set it to true or false. Depending on your specific use case, you may choose to ignore this for now. You also have the option to pass agent IDs, bot IDs, and assign conversation assignees. If you wish to assign a conversation to a specific agent, you can do so. This can also be configured from the dashboard. However, this functionality is also provided on the SDK side. Let's begin with launching a conversation for a visitor. I'll copy this launch conversation for a visitor section. Here, I need to pass the app ID again. Next, I'll go to the home screen where there's a Create Conversation option. I'll paste the code that I previously copied from the documentation. It seems I also need to add the import statement here. I'll copy this RNG Kommunicate chat and paste it here. Here you can see the conversation object. It requires the application ID, which you can simply copy from the login screen and insert here. Once done, pass the conversation object into the build conversation function of RN Kommunicate. This will create a conversation. Let's also log the failure case. If the creation is not successful, we'll log conversion creation failed. Let's print the response as well. After saving, run the program on Android and observe what happens. Now, let's reconnect it. Click on Login as Visitor once. Once the login is performed, proceed to the next screen. Here, we'll create a conversation by clicking on Create Conversation. Let's observe the results. The log shows conversion created successfully and returns a response. Here is the string, which is the ID of the conversation that has been created. You can see it here. We'll just cancel this one and that's it. Here's an example of a list that we have configured on the dashboard. When we pass the list, it simply returns the list items. This configuration has been set up, and now let's transition to a card format. Now that the bot is functional, you can see it working properly. It's quite straightforward. This way, a conversation can be created and the user can easily interact with it. Let's take a look at the SDK, where you can see the logout option. If you wish to use it, you can execute it from the SDK side. Alternatively, we can view the code for the logout function. Now, let's click on the back button and see. With the conversation creation completed, let's move on to the Open Conversation List. Essentially, the Open Conversation List is a feature that allows you to open a list of conversations for the user. For instance, to display the list of all conversations created by a user, we can make use of this Open Conversation function. Let's copy this function and paste it into our code. Now, let's unlock the message and log it. If there's an error, we'll paste Conversation List Failed and include the response and message. Once we've done that, we'll save our progress and restart the project. Now we'll run Android and navigate to the Login as Visitor screen. From here, we can log in as the creator and open the conversation list. Currently, this screen is empty because the user hasn't created any conversations yet. Let's quickly start a new conversation to populate this list. Let's begin by assigning a new condition to the bot. We can simply pass the same thing here. Let's pass the list, which creates a list for us. Now, let's pass a fallback, which will be used in case of any issues. In this way, the conversation will be assigned to another individual, possibly a manual user. This allows the conversation to be transferred to the user. You can easily create a conversation here. Now let's quickly demonstrate how to perform a logout in the SDK. Simply copy the specific piece of code from the logout section and paste it into the logout section of our SDK in the application. Log this response and print the logout confirmation. If successful, you'll see a message indicating the successful logout. After saving these changes, let's run the render Android again. Execute the app, which will reconnect to the tools and perform a login as a visitor. You can see how you can open a conversation list and start a new conversation. Feel free to explore and do random things. Let's try a few things and see what happens. All right, the organization has now been created. I'll go back. Click on the Logout button, and as you can see, the logout is successful. I can now navigate back to the home screen. The aim of this video was to introduce you to the basics of Kommunicate React Native, how to install and integrate the Kommunicate SDK into your React Native project, create a conversation, perform some basic operations, and then log out. For more detailed explanations or advanced use cases in your project, I recommend referring to this documentation. It covers everything from configuring push notifications to creating conversations. There are multiple types of conversations, and you can refer to this documentation for the parameters you can pass in the conversation object. Moving on to the customization section, you can add as many customizations as you want. We have a specific file here for customizations where you can pass the custom message background color, send message link text, and more. You can customize everything color-related, and if you want to show the attachment option for location or camera, you can enable that depending on your application requirements. You can also enable text-to-speech. These customizations are available for both Android and iOS. For iOS, I'll quickly run it for you. It's the same process as for Android. Just run React Native iOS and attach the chef tools to the iPhone. Let's wait while iOS builds. All right, let's proceed with this. The app has been built successfully. Now we need to reconnect it to the dev tools. We'll perform a login as a visitor, and as you can see, it's returning a null response. Despite the null response, the user is logged in. Now, let's create a conversation in iOS. We'll create the conversation, and as you can see, it's creating, reprinting the message, and starting the conversation. We'll repeat the same steps, passing the list here. Let's see what happens next. It should render a list for us here as well. You can see it's rendering this list for us. At the start of the card, it will also print a card and a generic card. So, it prints a card generated for us. That's the process of creating a conversation. If we quickly go back, we can open the conversation list here as we created the conversation earlier. It's displaying it for us here. We'll start the conversation and repeat the same steps here. So, it's the same. Let's proceed to log out. Performing the logout here, we can see that the logout is successful. This process is identical on the iOS side as well. That concludes this video, and we hope you found it helpful. In our upcoming video, we will cover more topics. If you have a specific use case, we recommend referring to the documentation of our React Native project. Should you have any queries or doubts, feel free to connect with us via the chatbot icon located at the bottom right of the screen. Our support team will promptly respond to your messages. That's all for now. Have a great day and goodbye.